and welcome to TVP World Talks. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. The European Union has made significant moves to reduce its reliance on Russian energy imports, limiting Russian coal, oil, and cutting over 2/3 of gas imports. Now, the EU's stated goal is to eliminate all Russian fossil fuels by 2027, but discussions around restoring fuel supplies do continue to resurface, with some arguing that resuming purchases could serve as leverage to encourage Russia to end its war in Ukraine. And joining me now to discuss this complex issue is Thomas O'Donnell, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, based in Berlin. Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks on TVP World.
Good evening. Thank you for having me tonight, Diana.
Now, from Ukraine's perspective, sanctions on Russian products have often been seen as a bit slow, as inadequate. The European Commission recently proposed sanctions on Russian aluminum, but notably actually refrained from banning Russian LNG. Now, do you think that it's realistic to expect that Europe will fully cut its economic ties with Russia, especially in the energy sector?
Well, would that they would. It's actually quite difficult. I mean, to look at it objectively, first of all, what we're up against here, there's really three superpowers, you might say, in the world of energy production. One is the United States, far and away nowadays, in oil and gas together. And then comes Russia and Saudi Arabia. And the problem is, if Russia were immediately taken offline in the oil sector, there'd be a tremendous shock. Now, the Americans and the G7 and the Europeans, when they first put sanctions, let me talk about, the reason I want to talk about oil first, the Russians make much more money selling oil than they do selling natural gas. And so what they decided to do is, rather than put traditional sanctions, say the way they put it on Iran, and just simply prevent them from selling it, they had this idea that pretty much seems to have come from central bankers who, I must say, didn't know a lot about how the oil market works. They said, we're going to let them leave it on the market. We're just going to restrict the price, put a price cap. And everybody basically who worked in the oil sector said, this is not going to work. There's so many ways to get around it. And as we all know, Putin, the Kremlin, has bought all these ersatz tankers, all these shadow fleet tankers, and they go around without having insurance or with having Chinese insurance or something and get around it. And it's kind of a whack-a-mole game, trying to stop these ships from getting to India or being accepted in China. And they had some notable successes at times by putting sanctions on the individual ships, but within a month or two, they get around it. So I've advocated, and other people in the sector have advocated, they should have just put real sanctions. And I mean, we could talk about that if you want. I think it is possible, very possible, if Mr. Putin embarrasses Mr. Trump by refusing to talk about making a deal in the war, Trump could put real sanctions on and really do damage. And right now, there's so much extra oil being held off the market by OPEC Plus, by the Saudis, the UAE, and others, almost 6 million barrels a day. You take 3 or 4 million barrels of Russian oil off the market, exports, that would seriously hurt their budget. Gas has hurt their budget, that's off the market, but that's a separate matter.
So, I mean, that is something I wanted to ask you next. I mean, you have answered that, of how much, if the West were to do that, and how severely those Western sanctions. I mean, now you're saying that if Trump were to do that, if Russia doesn't sit down on the negotiating table to end this war with Ukraine, that it would impact the Russian economy. But I mean, do you see this happening? Do you predict that it may take place?
Well, it's a little bit hard to predict where Trump is going, obviously, right? We see that he'd like this war over with, but he's also somebody who wants to look good. I have to say, Mr. Zelensky was very proactive. He went out of his way to go see Trump and talk to Trump, and he did what he had to do for his country. And Trump seems convinced pretty much of the fact is Zelensky wants to deal. What's the matter with you, Mr. Putin? Why aren't you dealing like this? So he managed to shift the ball to Putin's court for now. And I don't think Putin wants to stop the war. He's advancing in Ukraine. He has some goals he wants to reach before he would have any kind of serious discussion. So a lot of pressure might have to be put on the battlefield, and we'll see if they can get the Americans behind that. But if Trump really wanted to pressure him with oil sanctions, what I've been advocating is there's 3 westward-facing ports. There's two up in the Baltic and 1 in the Black Sea, where Russia exports about 40% of their total production. So that's about 3 million barrels a day, roughly, give or take. And if they put sanctions on these ports and said ships just can't come from there, we can't deal at all with ships from these ports, that would be pretty severe, I think. And at the same time, I just mentioned, the Ukrainians are capable of hitting these ports. In fact, their drones have already hit these ports, but not the oil export terminals. They've hit LNG that's stored there. They've hit some pipelines, refineries in the area. But this proves they could perfectly well hit those ports. But it's understood in the business that it's out of deference to the Americans, out of deference to the G7 and the EU, who's afraid if that oil was suddenly taken offline from those 3 ports, there could be a tremendous spike in the price of oil. And, Trump certainly doesn't want that because he promised it won't happen. My point is there's so much spare oil being held off the market by OPEC and by the frackers in the United States who can produce a lot more. China is not buying oil. They have been, like they did in the past, they haven't recovered well from COVID. And we know the European Union isn't doing very well. So demand is down. So you could incrementally take this oil offline. The Ukrainians, let them do what they want to do militarily to the same oil. That would be interesting. And, I talked to a leader of the Russian opposition who knows something about this stuff. And he said, just what you're mentioning, Thomas, that could be 15% of the Russian state's income. Oh, that would hurt his war-making capacity. I wish the West will decide to do this in oil. This is the way you can hurt Russia really severely without spiking the prices at this time because of the economic situation. There's extra oil in the market that could be put online.
Thomas, you said so many interesting things here, a lot of different factors. But now let me ask you this. If we stay on the EU, now Hungary and Slovakia have really strongly, of course, opposed the disruption of Russian gas transiting through Ukraine. Now, these protests, are they purely driven by economic concerns, or do you actually think that they reflect a broader political alignment with Vladimir Putin's regime? We have, Slovakia's Robert Fico, who has, strongly spoken out on this as well.
So I think it's a mix of things. And in Hungary and Slovakia, it's a little bit different. So first thing, like I'm sitting here in Germany, and the AfD, the extreme right party, would like to reopen. He said, "Why we should take the Russian gas? We should reopen Nord Stream." Now, a lot of people are saying this lately. There was a meeting, according to the Financial Times, there was a meeting in Brussels where some German and I think Austrian diplomats insisted, or officials insisted, this be taken up. So there's a discussion going around in the EU that, well, if Trump can pull off a peace deal in Ukraine, we could get the Russian oil back, the Russian gas back. And Russian gas up to the beginning of the war was 40 or 45% of the imports of the whole EU. So there's no doubt that this is really losing that Russian gas, which was over-dependent. It wasn't wise. Poland and other countries, the Baltic countries, the Americans, Democrat or Republican, for years told the European Union not to be so over-dependent. It can be weaponized, and it was weaponized. And we got through the initial energy war that first year, but it's still really hurting countries. And every country is suffering for competitiveness. The Germans here, for example. But now Fico, well, I understand he got elected on the promise, I can get cheap Russian gas for our country and have relations with Russia. Let's forget about Ukraine, and we're gonna do well. We're not going to suffer. And I have this relationship with Putin. So what happened is, now he should have known better. It's been 3 years, and the Ukrainians have said, when this contract's up, We've honored it for the sake of these countries, especially our neighbors in the eastern part of the European Union, the landlocked countries bordering or in the near of Ukraine, to help them get through. But you've had 3 years now, and you're going to have to get gas from other places. So even Austria, which was, I would say, quite pro-Russian in their attitude towards gas and very dependent on Russian gas right up till recently, at least they were realistic. They made plans to get gas from Italy, to get gas from southern Germany. And when they finally broke with Gazprom recently, they're getting gas and they're paying more. Of course, they're paying more. But Fico, he had promised in a populist way, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to get gas for a good deal from Putin. So I think he's both got a pro-Putin streak, and there's a lot of Ukrainianism in some of these societies that he's in a populist way, exploiting. And he promised to get cheap gas, and now he didn't get the cheap gas, and he's in trouble. There's mass demonstrations in his country against his government already. So I think it's to answer your question, it's a combination of economics. There's refineries in his country that are having a difficult time because of the high prices. Some of those refineries are owned by friends of Mr. Orban. Some are owned by the Germans, and so forth. So there's economic ties, but there's also political illusions about Putin.
And just very briefly, before we're almost out of time, Thomas, how do you see this unfolding, this entire situation?
Well, okay, so the Europeans intend, the vast majority of countries intend to get off Russian oil by 2027, as you said, maybe earlier. Now, the problem is, most of it is gone. The vast majority is gone. We're down to something like 5% got cut off that was going through Ukraine. I would say the problem is that the European Union made mistakes over many years of unrealistic energy policy, their transition policy, the Green Deal. And, everybody realizes you have to do something about climate change. They have to do it realistically. And I would say, like Germany is a good example here, over-dependent on wind and solar, but especially over-dependent on wind. And in November and early December, it was what they call Dunkelflaute here. It was dark, and there was no wind, and it was very cold. And they burned up all the excess gas they had in storage for the year. They were in a good situation. And this happened in several other European countries that were over-dependent on wind. And now they're desperate to get gas, and they're paying high prices, trying to get it from Asia. So Europe has a problem with its energy balance. The Germans actually closed the nuclear plants during an energy war, which makes absolutely no sense. It's purely ideological.
Thomas
If they hadn't made these mistakes, they could easily get through it, but they are going to have a difficult time getting off, and it's going to cost them more than it should otherwise.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That's all the time we have for today. Yeah, thank you so much for your input on this. Thomas O'Donnell, fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, based in Berlin. Thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me, Diana. Thank you. Good night.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more news and features from the region and beyond.
A Polish